So, this week we're talking about internal analysis or the internal environment. And this is really important because we've talked previously about the external environment, and those are the things not in the firm's control. Well, the internal environment, to a large extent, is in the firm's control. And so, these are things that are really important because it causes the leaders of a firm to take a deeper look. And we know with the internal environment, those are the decisions that firms make to leverage resources into capabilities that create core competencies that in the long term, we hope to create a sustainable competitive advantage, or at the very least, a competitive advantage for the firm. And we know that with core competencies, those are really like capabilities that when we leverage them together, serve as a source of competitive advantage for the firm. And as I mentioned, we hope that competitive advantage is sustainable for the longest extent possible. And there's some things that impact that, and we'll talk about those throughout the lecture. It is important to realize that resources in themselves are not necessarily, they don't create competitive advantage. So having a large pile of cash in your business, while that's an advantage, does not create a competitive advantage. It's how you leverage that cash or that investment into value for the customer that helps create the competitive advantage over time and create superior value for your customers. So if we think about it, there are three real factors that help make a competitive advantage sustainable. We have to look at the rate of obsolescence for your core competence. So is this something that's really easily overcome over time? Can things like tariffs or international trade impacts or a global competitor, can they render your competitive advantage obsolete? If so, then those environmental changes are a problem and your competitive advantage isn't really sustainable over time. So, if you have cheap components overseas and all of a sudden a tariff increases the cost of production by 100-fold, well, then you can't sustain a cost leadership competitive advantage with such a fast environmental change. So you have to think about things like that. If there are availability of substitutes for your core competency and they're just readily available and it's really easy for customers to get the same level of service or the same thing somewhere else, then it can render your competitive advantage obsolete. And then if it's easy to imitate, so if it's something that's low cost, low hanging fruit type stuff, then a competitor is going to come into the market and easily invest the amount of money it would take to imitate your core competence, right? So if customer service were really easy to imitate, then lots more firms would be competing with Chick-fil-A. But it takes an investment in training and culture in order to help create a customer service core competence. And that makes it more difficult to imitate. So we have to think about things that usually take long investments or large investments, long periods of time, those sorts of things are more difficult to render obsolete or to create substitutes for or to imitate. I think that this diagram from the chapter is really helpful in showing how it all ties together. So we have resources, which can be both tangible and intangible. Tangible resources are things like cash, facilities, human resources. Intangible are things like your brand, and that sort of thing. And then you have a tacit knowledge that you have in the industry or those sorts of things. Those help you create capabilities which are leveraged into core competencies. And those are all going to be shaped by like the uncertainty in the environment and the complexity and whether or not there's a lot of conflict within the organization. Because think about it, like if you're Amazon, you have core competencies that you're riding as hard as you can, but you also have to be developing new core competencies because you know that there are competitors coming into the marketplace. And so you have to be always mindful for that. And so that creates tension within firms where you're trying to make the most money out of what you already have, but you're also trying to find new core competencies so that you continue to create value over time. Then you really have to think too about as you got core competencies, then you want to discover more about your competencies. And so you want to think about, do these create a sustainable competitive advantage for me? And you can do that through looking at the VRIN framework, which we'll talk about a little later. You can also do value chain analysis. That helps you determine what core competencies create competitive advantage that give you strategic competitiveness in the landscape. As we're talking about all of this, we'll be using the word value a lot, and you just need to remember that value is really the attributes of a product that consumers are willing to pay. And that's the amount of value that your product creates or your service creates. In terms of resources, and I'm sorry, I misspoke earlier. Intangible resources can be things like, sorry, human resources can actually be tangible or intangible. So if you have a large, reliable workforce, that can be a tangible resource. Intangible might be the knowledge or the capital that the people in your human resources have available, right? Typically, we think of tangible resources, things like financial, like we can think about money, we think about physical, we think about the technology available at hand or data that you might have. Intangible are things like tacit knowledge that you have in the industry, maybe your reputation or brand, and innovation opportunities. In terms of capabilities, so we might have capabilities typically occur within functional areas like distribution, marketing and sales, operations, those sorts of things. And then there are capabilities from that. So like for example, within distribution, Walmart has a capability of logistics management. Um, Amazon within distribution has a capability of a very wide network of warehouses and distribution facilities. And with, thinking about Apple, they have, under the umbrella of marketing, they have effective brand promotion. Like they have a really strong brand that most people can recognize Apple across the globe. Okay. Just an example of capability. So you have something to like sink your teeth into. Then we have the VRIN framework. So this is valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable. Sometimes you'll see this as VRIO, and that's organizational, that you have the processes in order in place to like support it. But here we'll focus on VRIN. So valuable just means that it creates value for your customers. Rare means that like it's not something that just everybody can get their hands on. Inimitable means it's very difficult for your competitors to create something just like it. And then non-substitutable means like there's just nothing else that really gets at the same thing there. And we're going to run through some examples. So let's think about it this way. So let's look at Amazon. I mentioned them earlier, and I created this table in Gemini, just so you know. I think those kinds of tools are really helpful for this sort of thing. And I just said, create a table for me about how resources move, like how we're able through a company to create. We have resources. How do those create capabilities? And then how does that generate a core competency that leads to a competitive advantage? So let's look at Amazon. So Amazon, as we mentioned, has a huge network of fulfillment centers and warehouses, right? They have robotics within those warehouses, and then they have the AWS server farms that helps create a data network within that distribution facility. Intangibly on the resource side, they have all this data about you, right? If you are a Prime member, if you have Alexa, I mean, they're just constantly collecting data about you. They know what music you like they know what you purchase. They know how often you purchase it. They are able to recommend things to you and see whether or not you take that recommendation. So they have this customer obsession that's part of their culture. Like it truly is like if you look at sort of their values, customer obsession is one of them, and then people trust the brand. Okay. So we think about these resources, they really leverage into two organizational capabilities that are created by like processes, right? So resources are what they have, capabilities are processes. So what they do with those resources. So you have logistics orchestration. So if you think about this, they have algorithms that help automate inventory, and then they have this delivery. They're able to do 2-day delivery because of all this orchestration. They also are very innovative. So they are, because of the way their company is structured, with all the data and the customer obsession and their culture, they are able to fail fast and then launch new products. So they, think about things like Kindle, Alexa, the Go stores that you see at the airports now. And then they use the cash flow from Amazon Web Services, which is arguably their most profitable line of business. And then the core competency, like the ability to deliver millions of products or SKUs, store keeping units or stock keeping units. That's what SKU stands for. It's the different products and varieties that you have in 1 to 2 days or less. No one is able to match that. Walmart is doing a nice job because they're actually using their stores to help deliver as well. But truly, like to be able to order fully online and to have something in 1 or 2 days, it's unmatched. And that's through all the orchestration of data, inventory placement, and in their fleet, that they are able to orchestrate truly like to a scale that is hard to imagine. And then if you think too, they've like created a technological ecosystem. So they have the Amazon platform. You are there for shopping, Amazon Prime Video, cloud services. They even collect data. Like you can launch surveys through AWS, and get responses to surveys. I've used that before. So they've created unrivaled fulfillment speed as a core competency, and they truly have revolutionized the way we think as consumers about how fast things should get to us, right? Like Prime and the 2 day delivery is something that has like ingrained in us as customers that we shouldn't have to wait for things, but it's also facilitated a like buy now, think later type mentality. And then their technological ecosystem is just truly unraveled. And then we've also got the same thing for Walmart. Like you can look and run through how these resources create processes and capabilities and then core competencies as to why they win in that particular environment. And I think this is really helpful. You could go through and put in other companies that you admire and ask like Gemini or ChatGPT to help generate the same thing. And I think this is really helpful for understanding how all these things lock together. And I would encourage you to do that on companies that interest you. Okay. So then, if we're also looking internally, we can think about value chain. So I want you mainly to understand what the value chain is and then how it can create value. The textbook does a good job of this. They list both primary and secondary activities and how each one of those functions creates value for the customer. You have to think like you've got this calls it inbound logistics, but this is also supply chain, and making sure that all your components and that sort of thing get to you. Followed by operations, that is like the manufacturing or turning raw materials into components or finished products. Then how you distribute them to the customer, which is outbound logistics, marketing and sales. So you have to have a sales and marketing team both to like promote your product and also to like contract, whether you're doing B2B or B2C sales, creates your pricing strategy. You think of that as like your 4 P's of marketing or 5 P's, however you look at it. And then service after the sale or customer service. Okay. Those are all your primary activities. They create direct value for the customer. But then within your company, you're going to have things like procurement, IT, HR, all those things that are going to support those primary activities. And they also create value. So for example, if your procurement team is really good in doing their job and using data analytics to understand how your components and raw materials arrive, then that makes your inbound logistics better. It tightens your value chain within your primary activities. You can think about IT as well. Like if you have a strong technology unit that supports all of your operations and the primary activities, then you're going to have a more seamless experience from getting your raw materials all the way to service after the sale. And so allows you an opportunity to create value for customers. So be sure to take a look at that in the chapter because I think it's really important, but we won't spend a ton of time on value chain analysis in the class. But it is important that you understand the components and how they weave together and are integrated. So just to summarize, right, I think it's important to think about like why do we analyze the internal environment? And again, like think about it as finding ways to identify your strengths and weaknesses. So what are you really good at? Like what are those capabilities and core competencies? And then where are you falling short in comparison to your competitors? It really helps you to be reflective in terms of what are your resources, capabilities, and core competencies, and how do they weave together to create a competitive advantage? And is it one that is valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable? Your book does a great job about talking about the VRIN analysis. Please take a careful look at that. I don't want to rehash things. I want to more in these lectures take time to provide examples and give you like big picture type view. So if you have any questions, please post them to the discussion board that I put on Blackboard. Send me an email. I'm happy to help however I can. But hopefully this is helping you just get a little firmer understanding through examples and that sort of thing of the material in the chapter.